The Vietnam War, also known as the American War, or perhaps as Vietnam calls it, the Anti-American War. It was the first television war. Within this video we delve deeper into this war from 1955 till 1975 with the main players, the USA and Viet Minh. So how did these players justify this war? And what were the stories told? After the Second World War, Vietnam freed themselves from the invasion from Japan and Ho Chi Minh just declared Vietnam independence from France, which France did not accept. And so this resulted in a war. Russia, China and other communist regimes acknowledged Vietnam's independence. The United States, however, believed in the domino effect, a policy theory that states that vulnerable nations without help would fall one after another, like dominoes, in a communist regime. And it is this idea that will eventually result in the interference of the US in the Vietnam War. Because if Vietnam became communist, it would be bad for the US image of strength when battling the USS in the Cold War. So the US's goal was to contain the spread of communism from North Vietnam to the US-backed South Vietnam. Interestingly, this is not a typical war narrative, because no big event happened that would trigger instant patriotism and call to go to war, such as with the incident with Pearl Harbor. Propaganda is a technique that attempts to influence and control people's beliefs, emotions, or behavior. In his book, Falsehood in Wartime from 1928, Lord Ponsonby identified 10 principles of war propaganda. Later, these were empirically confirmed and divided in 2 sides by Anne Morelli. As can be seen, on the one side, the 6 principles in red are war propaganda aimed at praising and justifying one's own side, whereas the other principles highlight why the other side, the enemy, is evil. It is really binary. It's good versus evil.
So, what was the American narrative? The story they chose to sell: freedom and security for all. By intervening in South Vietnam in 1965, Americans were not just preventing communist domination. They were bringing the benefits of Western civilization, democratic reforms, and economic development. They had 2 objectives. First, military action against the Viet Cong and the North Armed Forces, and second, political and economic action among the South. To achieve this, they needed to conquer Vietnam by gaining the Vietnamese hearts and minds. This dual war had both a coercive and non-coercive nature. On one side, in order to weaken the enemy, attacks against the fighting morale of communists were needed. On the other, a heavy political economic propaganda was launched to convince the South Vietnamese to support the US. The expected result? Diverting popular support away from Hanoi and the Viet Cong and creating militant anti-communism in the South. The United States Information Agency tried to create a solid anti-communist nationalism among the population. As an example, they used nearly 50 billion leaflets across North, South, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Just to give you an idea, that's around 1,500 leaflets for every single person in both parts of the country. Other things like posters, banners, brochures, cartoon books, and even bumper stickers were used. 3 groups were targeted, each with a different message. First, the communists and their supporters in the South. White propaganda was put into place and the message was clear: give up the fight and return to the fold of the government of Vietnam. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops were threatened by death, but also lured by nostalgic elements and appealed to their homesickness and family life. Thus, going for a heavy emotional and binary approach, where the US painted themselves as not wanting a war, but having to fight it. The famous Christian mission or white man burden of fighting for the greater good, a noble cause, a sacred cause. Second, for the masses and elite of North Vietnam, stop your aggression in the South and throw up the joke of Chinese communist imperialism. Black propaganda was used to make North Vietnamese think that South Vietnamese were purposely fighting against Ho Chi Minh, thus trying to make it undetectable. One of the first leaflets, which was airdropped over the north and made to look of South Vietnamese origin, described the reasons for aerial attacks to the north as self-defense and as necessary to fight communist installations. Finally, for the non-communist South Vietnamese, a heavily binary approach was used. Support your government in its struggle against the North. By describing the evils of communism and encouraging patriotic support for the Republic, the war was clearly made good versus evil.
The Vietnam narrative is the hope of reuniting a divided country and fight the foraging invader. Vietnam called the war the Anti-American War. They urged people to fight or support the fighters in defeating the American troops for the unification of the North and the South of Vietnam. Their narrative was about spreading hope that Vietnam will one day be reunited. During the Anti-American War, people were asked to fight for the nation and the independence of the country. Propaganda was clearly reflected under one theme of strategy: for Vietnamese to fight. This was such as to construct the way for advancing northern troops to the south. Also, the propaganda was focused on praising the Communist Party and the North Vietnamese president, Ho Chi Minh. The posters that were made to sell the justification of the war on behalf of the Vietnam side came from the Soviet socialist realism ideology. The dominant style with the Vietnamese was focused on following the Leninist dogma that art is not art unless it is propaganda. During the war, it was about the social values and focus on unity, protection, peace, victory, and construction of the country. For instance, this poster made by the Communist Party celebrates the Communist Army victories in 1962 and 1963. Some other examples used, for instance, this one stating, "Liberate the South region, protect the North region, unite." The propaganda is emotional, cool, and also simple. And looking at the principles by Ponsonby, the artist supports the cause of war and is selling that the cause has a sacred nature. And so more phrases were used, like "the liberate South, defend the North, unite the country for the people's hope to be fulfilled," or "be enthusiastic to construct and protect the nation of Vietnam." And what about this one saying, "the face of the Vietnamese national room, the main performer of the Vietnamese man"? What can be seen often is that target groups were women, often by portraying these women in the posters as the frontline fighters. They also played a significant and extraordinary role during the difficult times in Vietnam. Women were coined the long-haired warriors and were expected to not only fulfill their domestic duties, but also to take up arms, respond to the needs of the nation, and defend their homeland. Many Vietnamese propaganda posters therefore portray powerful and strong women. As said earlier, another recurring theme was the portrayal of Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese president. Ho Chi Minh phrases decorated many posters, such as "nothing is more precious than independence and freedom," and "Vietnam has the right to enjoy freedom," and "happy peace." It is no surprise he was a popular focal point. The interesting thing about making these propaganda posters is that even for the makers it is often undetected as propaganda. Pham Thanh Tam was one of these artists during the time of the Vietnam side, and he said, "I wasn't conscious that this was the making of propaganda art. I simply thought of it as a means to help the public understand."
In essence, selling a war entitles a good communication design that will strengthen your narrative and weaken your enemy's narrative. The Vietnam War is a perfect illustration of how the nature of propaganda is the immersion in the conflict, being in the middle of a dispute for power. The basic scheme of how war messages are articulated and drawn from that nature is a dichotomous and Machiavellian scheme, based on having two sides, you, the good or the divine, and the other, the bad or the demonized. As seen so far, selling a war is achieved by the use of psychological warfare, political and economic propaganda that aims to weaken the enemy, creating disintegration, confusion, and breaking their spirit, as well as strengthening yours. There are three ways to legitimize power: by force, by influence, and by autoritas. Propaganda uses influence, which is based on persuasion, to convince your side and the enemies of your narrative. As Napoleon once said, there are but two powers in the world, the sword and the mind. In the long run, the sword is always beaten by the mind. Propaganda during the Vietnam War came from both the US and the Vietnamese government and targeted Vietnam. But what was happening back in America? The stories we tell about wars, like the wars themselves, are products of human action. We should pay attention to how people tell those stories and not solely what they have to say. Each US administration concentrated their efforts on the most influential media available, from television networks to the New York Times or Newsweek. While Vietnam did not make it to Hollywood during the 60s, it took over the small screen. With the increase of ownership and the development of portable video technology, television became the electronic window to the world. The war was there, in your living room. During the first year, the US government gave journalists access to the American troops, and the media reported on communism, the Cold War, and a clear US victory. National media coverage was selective and disregarded US propaganda in Vietnam. However, the increasing number of correspondents, the rise of civil rights and anti-war movements, and close up to the front lines started to show what was really going on. The perspective on the war started to shift and society became more critical, thus quickly becoming a problem for the US administration.